we treat concepts of mental health and therefore mental illness or mental disorder as if they are concrete entities that we can identify and categorize in the same way that we can identify and categorize a kidney dysfunction of some sort. But the thing is, all our definitions of mental health and therefore mental disorder and mental illness are subjective.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Dr. Sami Timimi wants us to rethink our idea of normal mental health. As a child and adolescent psychiatrist, Sami challenges the idea that every struggle needs a diagnosis and a treatment plan. He argues that our definitions of normal have been shaped by systems that can overlook life's context. Today we explore why our idea of normal keeps shifting, how this affects mental health care, and what can happen when we focus on relationships rather than labels. We also talk about his new book, Searching for Normal. I hope you enjoy the conversation. This podcast is brought to you by TELUS Smart Home Security. Secure, simplify, and easily monitor your home from anywhere using the Smart Home Security app. Visit telus.com/smarthome-security to learn more about Canada's most trusted security provider. Hi, Sami. It's really good to see you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
So you have a new book. It's coming out in Canada soon. It is called Searching for Normal, a new approach to understanding mental health, distress, and neurodiversity. What made you want to write this book?
Well, I've been practicing for over 30 years as a child and adolescent psychiatrist now. And I've done a lot of writing and researching. And most of my writing so far has been in the academic realm. So I've published books previously, but much more for a more of a professional academic audience. And there was something that made me want to write something that is more for the general public consumption, because I felt that the ideas that have been circulating around our societies are misrepresenting and leading to a misunderstanding of what we mean by mental health, by distress, and that some of the consequences of these is potentially harmful, not just to individuals, but to our culture as a whole. And I think one of the things that made me want to write this book at this particular time was what happened in the aftermath of the lockdowns during COVID. So here we had a enormously impactful psychosocial event happening in people's lives. And during that psychosocial event, actually referrals went down and people sort of got used to being in their homes, and young people didn't have to go into school, and some of them found that very difficult. Some of them actually were relieved to be away from the pressures of school. And then as we opened up again and young people had to go back to the, I don't know what you'd call it, the rough and tumble, the everyday struggles of being in such environments, we had a surge of referrals. And what disturbed me about the way these were being spoken about, both in the press but also in professional circles, it was as if this massive psychosocial event had never happened. So it was focusing on what was going on internally in these young people. So instead of thinking about, talking about, trying to understand the impact on people's psychology, if you like, and subsequently on their behavior and their responses, and keeping in mind what has just happened and how that might affect it, we just seem to head straight into an idea that we had to be making more diagnoses and putting them on these kind of formulaic treatment pathways as if the location of the problem was internal to people, rather, internal to these young people, rather than something to do with their understandable responses to what had been going on. So the timing felt like there was something that was really going out of control. It didn't start during the lockdowns, but there was something that accelerated this process and made it more visible. And so
There's a lot there. I have so many questions just from what you just said. You know, searching for normal. Well, what is normal? Does normal exist, or who says what normal is?
So towards the end of the book, the question that I posed wasn't necessarily one that was available to be answered. In some ways, I was posing that question slightly tongue in cheek, because at the end of the book, I conclude with a phrase that up close, nobody is normal. So the idea of normal is in itself subjective. And one of the points that I've been trying to make for a while, and I've tried to explain in as accessible a language as I can, is that we treat concepts of mental health, and therefore mental illness or mental disorder, as if they are concrete entities that we can identify and categorize in the same way that we can identify and categorize a kidney dysfunction of some sort. But the thing is, all our definitions of mental health, and therefore mental disorder and mental illness, are subjective. So I've done this exercise with loads of different, because I've spoken to lots of different audiences: psychiatrists, psychologists, teachers, lay people, psychotherapists, trainees, more experienced. And I've asked them, give me your best definition of what you think a mental health or a mental disorder is. And I've had lots of lovely different attempts, from having balance in your life, from your ability to function, from absence of low mood, even from kind of statistical ideas about variations on a spectrum. The problem is none of them have what you would call an empirical anchor. None of these definitions can go beyond an idea and a impression, rather than something that you can measure that's in the external world to the imagination of the person who is making the definition. What this means is that we literally don't know what we're talking about when it comes to mental health.
Well, that makes sense to me, actually. When you put it that way, because how do we know what's going on? And we're talking about children too. You specifically work with children. So when people are when families are worried about their child, or they're looking for a diagnosis, right? They're looking for the reason. Why is this happening? I can see how this is really confusing, because it's really only the child knows what's happening, but they don't know what's happening because they're a child, right? And so if we're talking about, it could be really anything, but like ADHD or autism or depression, anxiety, many things, a lot of times people are looking for a diagnosis because we think that that will be the answer. Then we have I guess human beings like that, right? We have a question, we want an answer, then we can fix it.
Yep. Yes.
That's not how it works. So, or it is what's happening, really, isn't it?
Yes. And unfortunately, this is not what's happening. It is what's happening in terms of what people are seeking, but it's not providing, and all the evidence suggests that it's not providing particularly long-term improvements. In fact, in many areas, it seems to be doing the opposite. But what you're highlighting is the product of a particular culture that's developed because we've made such technical progress in so many different areas. We are in some way, we've had our psychology trained to expect that there are technical solutions, there are technical fixes to many of life's problems of living, if you like. But this is an area where we are not dealing with the same type of knowledge that what I'm referring to as, if you like, the experiential understanding, which is amenable to the same process-driven approach. That there is a problem, that we know how to categorize it, and once we've categorized it, we know we've got an explanation, and therefore we have an idea of what the solution might be. But that is not the case when it comes to mental health. One of the things that we do have that we can say is what happens in what we think of as, if you like, psychological knowledge in this area of experiential knowledge, is that we are meaning-making creatures. We seek meanings. We try to make sense of what's going on. So one of the things that I am trying to help, if I can, people understand a little bit more is that when it comes to people's experiences, children's experiences, their behaviors that come out of those experiences and the way they're interpreting things, we have options, which means that we're unlikely to be able to put our finger on the cause. I often liken this to peeling a never-ending onion. As soon as you peel one layer, another layer reveals itself, another layer and another layer and another layer. Why? Because we're made up of a multiplicity of things. We have our genes, we have our experiences, the people we meet, the things we hear about, what happens in our family, what happens in our school. There's so many things that go on during the building of a life that the idea that you can put your finger that it's this one thing is the thing that I think we need to be suspicious of. You have a problem and you're trying to reduce the problem. So you think of a problem in terms of symptoms, and then in your approach is, how do I reduce the symptoms? And that can be a psychological approach, or it could be medication or whatever. But that leaves out a whole set of areas that is also part of people's experience. Because another way to think, if you think about this as a sort of a set of scales, on the one side, you have the problems that are weighing you down, but on the other side, you have all the bits of your life that actually you're skilled in, you've strengthened, histories of problems you've managed to get through in some way. So there is a whole other set of things that provide an alternative framework for thinking about. What I tell my trainees, because a lot of the people who come to visit us in clinics tend to have had, for want of a better expression, pretty awful lives. They tend to be people who've experienced a lot of unhappy events. What I remind my trainees is that stories of suffering are also often stories of survival. And we should bear witness to people's suffering, to validate it, to um, to take it seriously, to help them feel heard. But we should also be able to nurture those stories of survival, those parts of themselves that managed to keep going, that got through a problem. In fact, I would say the people that I've seen in clinic over my 30 plus years of practice as a child and adolescent psychiatrist are some of the most resilient, most amazing, most heroic in a very ordinary way people I've ever met. They're, the capacity to somehow keep going despite how awful you feel, how insecure you feel. There's something very human about that. So those are other stories that we can also help people notice. And so I see a lot of my job is not in imparting anything particularly profound in terms of new knowledge and expertise, but actually I think the expertise comes in helping people realize knowledge that they had that they didn't know they have.
We've had this abundance of diagnoses, say when it comes to autism, when it comes to lots of things. But I hear people say they have anxiety so much that I don't even know, like, have you been diagnosed with anxiety, or do you have anxiety, or do you know what I mean? Like, I don't even know where it's coming from. I know you know. You're like, yes, I do know. So
I think I do anyway.
I think you do too. I mean, I did go to your website and I attempted to read some of the things that you've written, and I was like, whoa, this is above my pay grade here. This is this is intense. How do we have more autism? Do we have more ADHD? Do we have a mental health crisis? Or are we I think what you're saying is we're doing it wrong.
Yeah. I love that reflection, because I think you're doing you're speaking out loud what's happening for a lot of people, which is, I think we're scratching our heads wondering what the hell is going on? Where has all this come from? Why are so many people presenting like this? What's going on? Are we overdiagnosing? Are we more stressed? What's going on here? So there is something that is being referred to as the treatment prevention paradox. The treatment prevention paradox is saying that in societies, and this is particularly Western societies where mental health services are most developed and where there's the largest number of people accessing services, whether that's privately or state-run, whether that's medication or psychological or other types of therapy support, they also appear to be the societies with the continuing increasing number of people who are being diagnosed with mental health problems. And it's called the treatment prevention paradox because if the approach that we were taking was actually being successful, we should not see a continuing increase. We should see an increase in the number of people accessing therapies coinciding with a decrease in the prevalence in the population, not the opposite. So that's why it's called a paradox. And my fear is that we've been training the population to think in diagnostic terms about their emotional experiences. Because if you access a meaning-making model that says, yes, you've got this disorder and it's internal to you, whether it was caused by trauma or by bad genes or chemical imbalances or whatever, that you've got something that's internal to you. And all of these conditions have the word disorder after it, suggesting that something is wrong. And that something is wrong is somewhere within you. And what it sets up is the potential for you to end up in a battle with a part of yourself that you experience as something broken or wrong, something that needs to be suppressed, something, even just the idea that something needs to be understood before that part of you is going to come back online. But it sets up a potential conflict. And what I have seen is once you enter that idea that there's something in you that you have to suppress or control in some way, and it either doesn't go away or it goes away and comes back again, each step along the way, you're going to experience that part of you as being more powerful than you thought. And this leads to what I've seen, and I suspect you've seen, is that what happens is that people, including kids, start to collect more labels. So they might start out with autism. A few years down the line, they get ADHD. Another few years down the line, they've got anxiety. Another few, and so on. And you see this with adults as well, collecting labels: depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, because there feels like there's a part of them that keeps taking over again. So that's a model of understanding mental distress and emotional intensity, which can set you up for a battle, and it can set you up to become a long-term consumer of what I've referred to as the mental health industrial complex. And I don't think that's good for us, and I don't think that's good for our societies, because we're accidentally undermining our natural human resilience. I don't believe resilience is something you can teach. I think resilience is something you discover. And I think as you grow up, particularly during adolescence, you undergo struggles, you undergo confusions, you undergo new situations, new emotional intensities, fallouts. You fall in love, you have sexual urges. All of these things are happening. And if you start to label some of this intensity as potentially being disordered, you may be undermining people's capacity to learn to bear, to learn to tolerate, to learn to live with. And that's the way you deepen your understanding of yourself and you deepen your capacity for resilience.
Mm. Wow. That makes sense. It's so I've never I've never really looked at it through that lens, and it's so fascinating. Um, One of the things that we do here is we thank our guests for being here by asking them to choose a Canadian registered charity, and you chose Food Banks Canada. So, Sami, we will make a donation in your name as a thank you to Food Banks Canada. It's a thank you for being here. So, thank you for choosing them. I mean, I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, because there's so many layers to obviously it's not a one size fits all. It's not nobody's saying that there aren't real diagnoses happening. There are.
And I'm not saying that the behaviors or experiences aren't real, distressing, and sometimes disabling. I'm just questioning the frameworks we use to understand them.
And when you look at us, when you look at mental health culturally or, internationally, do different cultures, like, do we all do it differently? Like, is it only...
Yes. And that's something that I've been interested in, spent quite a long time looking at different ways of understanding childhood, child development, family life, and distress and how it's dealt with and how it's understood. And in general, there is a difference between what you might call individualist societies that focus on what happens within individuals, and collectivist societies where the concept of the self is very dependent on relationships. So that's one area where there are quite big differences. Individualist societies tend to look for, if you like, approaches that nurture the individual, whereas collectivist societies are much more interested in how you nurture relationships. And I mean, there's obviously a whole a whole lot of complexity to go into there.
But Sami, is there a country or a place or that is doing mental health well?
It's rather than any one country. There are quite a lot of projects around the world. There was a publication a couple of years ago, which was a collection of these different types of projects. One of the places that was most impressive is a part of Italy called Trieste, who have a very community-orientated mental health system. And they start by the idea that you co-collaborate, that you're dealing with the problems of living, that you work with things like housing, employment. Their mental health systems are involved with running businesses and developing businesses who people with mental health problems get involved with. It's very community centric. It doesn't focus on the idea of treatment pathways by diagnosis. Their first session is called the engagement session, not assessment. All of these sorts of things which bring it back into kind of the more human realm as opposed to this more clinical artificial. There are doctors working there because doctors are always going to be part of mental health services because many mental health presentations either cause a lot of physical issues or physical issues can contribute to the development of mental health presentations. So there's always going to be doctors involved, but the atmosphere and the way this service is developed, it focuses more on, if you like, a problem-based, a human-based, a community-based, as opposed to a diagnosis individual treatment pathway. So that is one of the and the interesting thing about there is they have the lowest number of psychiatric beds in Europe, and they have very, very few emergency psychiatric presentations. In other words, the type that leads to a person being put on a type of mental health act where they have treatment against their will. Very, very few of them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I talk a little bit about the Trieste model in the book.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
Because in Italy, there is a very interesting history. In the late 1970s, early 80s, there was a movement called democratic psychiatry, which was led by a psychiatrist who opened the locked doors of the asylums and exposed some of the worst practices that were going on, and actually was involved in a whole political movement, lobbying politicians that eventually led to them changing several laws to take psychiatric care out of the kind of draconian hospital system at the time and move it into the community.
That's beautiful, actually, and that I feel like I feel like I could talk to you for hours more because I was just going to ask you more and more questions. And I'm like, I can't. But we can read your book, Sami. It's really been fascinating talking to you. And there's like every time you say something, I have 10 more questions to ask you. I always like to think about, well, what's the bright side of things? And I mean, so I want to ask you what you think, what's your bright side? And I'll tell you after this conversation, you talking about Italy there, I feel like that is quite a bright side. But when you think about the bright side of your work, what is your bright side?
So this might seem a little left field. Is that an expression you use in Canada?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So this might feel a little left field, but we're living in pretty dark times politically, economically. But there is a saying that the night is darkest before the dawn. I think we're living in times where things are changing, and that makes the times quite dangerous because they're quite unexpected things. But it's often when things are challenging and when things are difficult where the possibility for new ideas, new openings, and genuine shifts become possible. So I have a feeling, whether it's in my lifetime or whether it's after I leave this particular mortal coil, that a change in the way we think about and approach mental health care is not only going to happen, but it's inevitable to happen. If you look at the history of science, it actually takes quite a long time before a new paradigm, a new way of looking at things is allowed to enter into becoming mainstream, because because science is something developed by humans. Humans hold on to their particular belief systems and try and squeeze data that doesn't fit into their models for as long as they can before eventually there's enough of a younger generation or other people who are coming along. And it does feel like there's a bit of a critical mass of people who are now asking the same sort of questions that I've been asking for a couple of decades now.
Well, that's good. That is a bright side. Once again, your book is called, can you just hold it up for a second, Sami?
This is the English version, so it's, yeah.
Searching for Normal is the title, A New Approach to Understanding Mental Health Distress and Neurodiversity. Sami, thank you so much. Your website is Sami Timimi. That's timimi.co.uk. And you're also on Instagram at dr_Sami Timimi. Thank you so much, Sami. It was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.